Welcome to Scriptura's layer-by-layer overview of Psalm 31. I entrust my spirit into your hand. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hand. I've been forgotten like a dead person. I've become like a broken vessel. Blessed is the Lord, because he has wonderfully shown me his faithfulness to me in a city under siege. Psalm 31 is like so many of David's psalms. Exalted confidence in the Lord stands side by side with deep distress. For David, both are equally true. This is why he speaks just as strongly and passionately about times of triumph as about times of despair. Circumstances are often difficult, but the Lord's people can still trust in him. The phrase, in the Lord's hand, captures the hope of this psalm. It is an image of being under the Lord's power and protection, no matter what happens. As long as David remains in the Lord's protective, powerful hand, he can be at peace. As long as the Lord remains in control, David can rest. Psalm 31 splits into 3 equal sections. The first and last sections have to do with refuge, a safe place where the psalmist is protected from danger. The psalmist is looking to the refuge in the first section, and he is sheltered in the refuge in the last section. The middle section deals with the psalmist's misery, so we have called it shamed yet trusting. If we think of the first and last sections as guarding the middle, we can see that they serve as a poetic image to show that God is protecting David even while he suffers shame. The first and last sections bring focus and reinforce the psalm's central message. Even when David cannot understand how the Lord might rescue him, he can still trust that the Lord is with him and will protect him. Within each section, there are 2 smaller sections. All of these smaller sections contain a direct address to the Lord, except the very last one. In the first section, verses 2 to 9, which we have summarized as looking to the refuge, David the psalmist asks God for help. He cries out, "Be my refuge, so my shame won't continue forever." In his cry, David does not hide his distress, but openly lays it before the Lord. Throughout this section, David emphasizes that the Lord is his only refuge, his rock, his unmovable foundation and fortress. David can do so because side by side with his distress, he has hope. He trusts that since God rescued him from distress in the past, God will rescue him again. Since God acted on David's behalf before, God can now save David from the latest net or trap his enemies have spread for him. David has this hope because he is in a covenant relationship with the Lord. Others who trust in worthless idols have no such hope. But David knows God's character and actions. David knows God's faithfulness, so his own hope is secure. In the second section, verses 10 to 17, which we have summarized as shamed yet trusting, David discusses the nature of his current distress. Significantly, in this section, he calls on the Lord by name in verses 10 and 15. Between those verses lies a lament, which is an expression of sorrow or mourning. Interestingly, the lament here has no mention of God's name. This is a common poetic device to depict the experience of the Lord's absence. Within the lament, there is a list of distressing complaints. David complains that his life is slipping away and his body is weakening under the weight of anguish. He is suffering physically, and perhaps as a result, he has also become a social outcast. He has been scorned by enemies and neighbors alike. The greatest shame of all is being forgotten, and as if he had no value, and this seems to be a reality for David. Amidst human schemes to take his life, the psalmist also feels as if the Lord his God is absent. The short 2-word phrase, "but I," is one of the most powerful transitions in many psalms. It shows that the psalmist is no longer focusing on his current situation, but instead on what he believes to be true in the larger picture of life. After the lament, in verses 10 to 14, in which David seems to live his greatest fears, he nonetheless firmly declares in verse 15, "But I trust you, Lord." So, in spite of his suffering and shame, David remains firm in trusting the Lord. He knows his times are in the Lord's hand, which includes both his times of honor and his times of shame. David laments, but he also has hope that when he calls upon the Lord to rescue him from suffering, the Lord will respond. In the third section, verses 19 to 25, which we have summarized as sheltered in the refuge, David prays for the Lord to reverse his circumstances. He says, "Don't let me be ashamed or let down. May the evil ones be ashamed." Because David knows God's character, he can be confident that God will justly punish the wicked according to what they deserve. David prays that the Lord would take away the shame which he doesn't deserve and put the shame on David's enemies where it belongs. David's prayer hints at events and circumstances that may have prompted his outcry. In his prayer, David focuses on lying lips, false accusations, and mentions a city under siege. David often endured many of these bad experiences when he was running away from Saul. Justice requires that the Lord would reverse the bad experiences David did not deserve. Justice also requires that the Lord would give those who acted wrongly what they deserve. This section of the poem focuses on these kinds of reversals. The psalmist poetically portrays the most powerful reversal by contrasting the second and third sections. In verses 10 to 14 of the second section, we saw in the lament that the Lord seemed to be absent and David forgotten. In the third section, in verses 19 to 21, the psalmist is actually absent, but he has certainly not been forgotten. This section is unlike the rest of the poem because it has no references to the psalmist. Poetically, that often suggests he is absent in some way. In this section, however, the psalmist's absence cannot show that the Lord has rejected or forgotten him because the section is all about how God cares for his own people. The psalmist is not visible, but the Lord has not forgotten him. Instead, the Lord has hidden him from view. The psalm describes the Lord as sheltering and hiding his people from the plans of others. In the same way, the psalm poetically shelters and hides its suffering speaker. In the same way that the Lord's saving acts shelter and protect those who fear God, the psalm creates a protective space, a refuge for the psalmist from all danger. He is hidden from danger. David expresses the reality of the Lord's care and protection later in the section when he cries out to the Lord in verse 23 by saying, "In my panic, I thought I had been cut off from your sight. However, you heard the sound of my pleading when I cried out to you." David's confidence then turns into joy. We see his joy when David turns to all who trust in the Lord and encourages them by saying, "Love the Lord. He will treat you as he treated me. He watches over his faithful to rescue them, and he abundantly repays those who act pridefully, those arrogant enemies who endanger God's people." So even in desperate circumstances, David urges those who wait for the Lord to persevere. He encourages them by saying, "Be strong, so your hearts may take courage. The Lord has not forgotten his own people. He is always faithful." David feared he had not only been shamed, but forgotten and rejected from society. When the Lord rescued him, he experienced a reversal in which his own affliction, his shame, was taken from him and given to his enemies. David learned that even when he thought the Lord had forgotten him, the Lord was actually sheltering him and protecting him. He was in a refuge, safe from those who sought to take his life. This is a journey through a cycle of fear and relief, vulnerability and faith. David is in danger, finds refuge in God, and finds God faithful to rescue. This is a trustworthy pattern, David says, for all God's loyal ones. Psalm 31 does not mention a specific historical situation, but the words it uses suggest a connection to one situation recorded in 1 Samuel 23. That is when David had to run away from Saul, Israel's first king. While he was running from the king, David sought help where he could because the king wanted him to die. David had to choose what to do and how to act so people would not kill him. On one occasion, he had to lie to a priest, Ahimelech, to secure food and weapons. At another point, he pretended to be insane to escape from the court of the enemy Philistine king, Achish. On these occasions, David chose to act less honorably so he could live, And so he experienced shame and scorn, like the speaker in Psalm 31. But the key story that shows the conflict in Psalm 31 is David's rescue of the city of Keilah from the Philistines. There, David's men saved the city of Keilah, but its people did not respond with gratitude. When Saul arrived with his troops to attack Keilah and captured David, the men of Keilah decided to give David to Saul instead of protecting him. Instead of being grateful to David, they were ready to deliver him over to Saul and certain death. Well, because the men of Keilah were going to deliver him to Saul, David was forced to flee once more. He escaped Saul's attack on the city, and he moved from place to place with hundreds of his men. Eventually, he hid in the wilderness of Ziph, finding refuge in the mountains. When Saul realized David escaped him at Keilah, he once again began looking for David, and David was in danger again. This time, betrayal came from the Ziphites, who reached out to Saul, offering to surrender David to him. As Saul and his forces were approaching to capture David and his men, the king received a message about the Philistines coming to attack, and so Saul left. In a few moments, David went from facing capture and death to being rescued, both when Saul attacked Keilah and in the wilderness of Ziph. In the middle of evil plans, treachery, and danger, God spared David. He hid David from his pursuers. This background helps us understand what the writer of Psalm 31 may have meant when he talked about being insulted, forgotten, and treated badly. He likely meant that people were not thankful to him for helping and protecting them. He also heard about people planning to betray him and had to deal with others who told lies about him. Most importantly, he was in a city under siege or under attack. All of these would have been vivid memories David had of his time as a fugitive on the run from Saul. We'll now go through the psalm in more detail, section by section.
For the director, a psalm by David. I have taken shelter in you, Lord. Do not let my shame continue forever. Rescue me in your righteousness. Listen to me. Rescue me quickly. Be a rock of refuge for me and a fortress to deliver me, because you are my rock and my stronghold, and for the sake of your name, you must carefully guide me. You must save me from the net which they have hidden for me, because you are my refuge. I entrust my spirit into your hand. You have redeemed me, Lord, God of faithfulness. You hate those who worship worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. I will be glad and rejoice on account of your faithfulness, that you saw my affliction. You saved my life from distress. You did not let any enemy capture me. You set my feet in a broad place.
Before the first section begins, we have the superscription in verse 1. The psalm is explicitly said to be for the director and by David. The phrase, for the director, indicates that this psalm was written for temple musicians and singers to sing or perform. That suggests they would sing the psalm on multiple occasions and not simply once. Even if the psalm was written after a particular incident, it became intended for a wide range of circumstances. It is possible that the psalm is based on a specific memory, but now has a message that applies to many situations. The phrase, by David, means that the psalm was written by God's covenant partner, David, who became king over Israel. God chose David to lead his people. David began to lead even before he became king, when hundreds gathered around to follow him and fight for him. As a poet, David spoke in his psalms about his experiences and also his responsibilities to instruct and care for those around him. This explains why many psalms first speak of David and then encourage others to learn from his own experience toward the end. The first section is poetically marked by a combination of first-person forms, referring to David as a speaker, and second-person forms, indicating God as David's audience. We will see this change in future sections. Here, David seeks shelter in the Lord, who has consistently demonstrated himself to be a safe refuge. To emphasize God's role as shelter and defender, David deploys a variety of terms and images. Shelter, rock of refuge, fortress, my rock, my stronghold, my refuge, and a broad place. These terms bind this section together as one unit, underscoring David's trust in God. As with all but the final subsection, the two subsections in this first section begin with the name Lord in direct address, meaning that the Lord is the one to whom David speaks. The first subsection introduces the theme of shelter with a very prominent poetic feature in verses 3 to 5. There, the poet creates a small chiasm, or nested pairs, by using various words for shelter, with refuge as the outermost pair, fortress or stronghold, similar Hebrew, the inner pair, and rock at the very middle. The purpose of a chiasm is usually to emphasize the middle word. This word for rock could have been prominent in David's memory, and for good reason. It was the name for the place where David was when Saul miraculously stopped pursuing him in 1 Samuel 23:28. The second subsection begins in verse 6 with the second instance of the name Lord as a direct address. The subsection begins with David choosing to entrust himself to the Lord's power or hand. It finishes with David's testimony that indeed the Lord never let him become captive to an enemy's power or an enemy's hand. David's confidence is based on his relationship with the Lord. David has come to seek shelter or to take shelter in the Lord, and he has entrusted his spirit into the Lord's care because he trusts in him. Those who worship other gods in the form of worthless idols are hated or rejected by the Lord. But David has confidence that he will not be rejected. He can be glad and rejoice because the Lord does rescue David regularly and did rescue David on a memorable occasion when, instead of making him captive, the Lord set his feet in a broad place or brought him to complete safety and security. Right against the backdrop of 1 Samuel 23, this section could be taken as reflecting the time when David was almost made captive to Saul, first in Keilah and then in the wilderness of Ziph. But just as in the wilderness, actual rocks and strongholds served as refuge for David and his men, so did the Lord, a metaphorical rock, stronghold, and refuge, protect David's life from all those who sought it. Notably, in his time as a fugitive, David worshipped the Lord exclusively. David obeyed the Lord's word to both go up to Keilah, to protect it, and to depart from Keilah. In each case, the Lord redeemed him from his enemies who had spread a net or a trap to catch him in it. Significantly, the Hebrew word distress used in Psalm 31 comes from the same word as siege. So, when the Lord rescued the psalmist's life from distress, his rescue operation also can include the idea of rescuing him from a siege.
Be gracious to me, Lord, because I am in distress. My eye, my throat, and my belly waste because of anger, because my life fades away with grief, and my years fade away with groaning. My strength has failed because of my iniquity, and my bones waste away. I have become scorned by all of my adversaries, and I have greatly become an object of scorn to my neighbors, and I have become an object of fear to my friends. Those who see me in the street have fled from me. I have been forgotten like a dead person is forgotten from memory. I have become like a broken vessel, because I heard the slander of many people. Terror is on every side. When they conspired together against me, they plotted to take my life. But I trust you, Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hand. Deliver me from the hand of my enemies and from my pursuers. Shine your face upon your servant. Save me by your faithfulness.
The middle section, verses 10 to 17, which we have summarized as shamed yet trusting, is the emotionally charged part of the psalm. As the first section before it, it subdivides into two shorter units, each opening with Lord in verses 10 and 15 respectively. We should notice that between these two instances of Lord, divine names disappear altogether in the text. This symbolizes the absence of God and reflects the real distinct sense of distress, deep distress. Such arrangement of themes and experiences reminds the audience of the cyclical nature of David's journey with God. Despite the relief he has repeatedly found in God's deliverance, David's life remains one of constant trouble. David experiences that trouble by going through physical anguish, abandonment by friends, betrayals, slander, and plots to kill him. Some of these experiences are voiced in his lament in verses 10 to 14. The lament begins and ends with the word for soul, which can also mean throat or life. With two occurrences of the name Lord in verses 10 and 15, and two occurrences of the word for soul in verses 10 and 14, the psalm creates a double frame for David's lament. This double frame connects the psalmist's soul or life and God's name. David's very life is at stake, but his life has been entrusted to the Lord. Despite the troubles described in the lament, there is a hint of hope. In the lament, David describes his anguish while he faces danger. His eye, throat, belly, and very life fade away with grief. This grief has multiple sources, including David's own iniquity, that is, his own wrongdoing, and the wrongful slander of others against David. Again, the story in 1 Samuel may help explain this combination of ideas. When David first fled Saul, he went to the priest Ahimelech. There, he wrongfully lied to the priest, which led to the slaughter of Ahimelech's family. The responsibility for the death of an entire priestly family was a heavy burden to bear for David, and he mourned it greatly. He knew it was his fault. The slaughter happened after one of Saul's officers reported that Ahimelech had helped David. The report fueled Saul's fear that David was a threat to his throne. And in his fear, Saul became determined to hunt down David to kill him. Many joined in, even those David had once rescued, such as the inhabitants of Keilah. In that troublesome season, David had times when he was simultaneously grieving his own poor decisions and was surrounded by terror on every side. People really were conspiring together against David, plotting to betray him and take his life. Sometimes they were the very people whose lives he had just spared. In 1 Samuel and in Psalm 31, David needed to be rescued, both from his own wrongful decisions and from the wrongful decisions of others. His lying to Ahimelech brought terror and slaughter to Ahimelech's family. Saul's hunting down David brought terror to David and all his men. Terror is on every side was true in many ways. The next subsection brings the major transition in the psalm. It opens with, "But I trust you, Lord." The phrase, "but I," stands out immediately as introducing a contrast with what was said previously. It was true that David was in grave danger and that everyone was against him, but it was also true that he could trust the Lord and that the Lord could overcome every threat. In saying, "You are my God," David reaffirms his loyal relationship with the Lord. In this loyal covenant relationship, David's responsibility is to obey, and God's responsibility is to protect him. By declaring his loyalty, David shows that he refuses to believe that the enemies surrounding him are powerful enough to overcome him, if the Lord is truly his refuge. In the first section of the psalm, there was wordplay with the word hand. David entrusted himself to the Lord's hand and affirmed that he would never be captured by the enemy's hand. In verse 16, he returns to this image, saying, "My times are in your hand." David's fate is secure in the Lord's power. He means that even if, at the present moment, his situation looks hopeless and his life is in danger, that does not change the reality of the Lord's protection. The Lord remains in control of David's future, and this gives David absolute security as long as David is focused on the Lord. When David turns away from the Lord and sees his own physical wasting away and social isolation, then he despairs. But when he returns to focus on the Lord, then confidence and hope also return. The confidence and hope are conveyed in 3 similar commands, all of which have the same form in Hebrew. In these command forms, God is the one causing or bringing about deliverance. Deliver me, shine your face, save me. Whenever something happens 3 times in Hebrew, it tends to signal a superlative, which means it has the highest level of importance or emphasis. These commands return David from despair to being in full alignment with the Lord as an ever-present refuge.
Lord, do not let me be ashamed, because I have called you. May the evil ones be ashamed. May they go silently to Sheol. May lying lips be unable to speak, those that speak insolence against the righteous with arrogance and contempt. How many are your good things, which you have stored for those who fear you, and which you have performed for those who take refuge in you, for all people to see. You shelter them from people's schemes in the cover of your presence. You hide them in a shelter from contentious people. Blessed is the Lord, because he has wonderfully shown his faithfulness to me in a city under siege, even though I thought in my panic I had been cut off from your sight. However, you heard the sound of my pleading when I cried out to you. Love the Lord, all his loyal ones. The Lord is watching over the faithful, and he abundantly repays those who act pridefully. Be strong, so your hearts may take courage, all who wait for the Lord.
The final section opens, as expected, with another Lord, and with the first reversal. Lord, do not let me be ashamed, but may the evil ones be ashamed. When David's focus shifts from his own afflictions to the Lord's character and power, reversals happen. When David focuses on himself, he sees shame and pain. When he focuses on the Lord, he sees that his enemies are the ones who will bear shame in the end. It is David's enemies who will go silently to Sheol, meaning they will be condemned to death and have no opportunity to appeal. The basis for David's request is, because I have called on you, meaning David has called on the Lord. This refers to David's exclusive worship of the Lord. He's not one who worships worthless idols. He calls only on the Lord for aid. He depends fully and exclusively on the Lord. The first subsection, verses 18 to 23, begins and ends with calling or crying out to the Lord as the hallmark of the one who worships God and as the basis for the one whom God will deliver. The lying lips in verse 19 and those who speak insolence with arrogance and contempt create a vivid image of enemies. Once again, this describes well what David encountered when running from Saul. Men lied by telling Saul that David did harm when he had not, as we can read in 1 Samuel 24:9. Insolence, arrogance, and contempt are likely accurate descriptions of those people in Keilah whom David delivered from the Philistines, but who, instead of being grateful, offered to surrender him to Saul. The Ziphites as well actively plotted to surrender David to Saul. David was surrounded by those who sought his harm, not his good. The description of his enemies begins a stretch of several verses in which the psalmist disappears as a participant. The psalmist's disappearance recalls the previous lament in which the Lord disappeared as a participant. In poetry, the presence of one participant without another would often suggest that the one who is present has overcome the one who is absent, especially after the lament in which the psalmist thought himself forgotten. This raises a question. What has happened to the psalmist? He had a painful history of when he lied. What would become of him? Verses 20 to 23 answer the question with the reversal mentioned before. Those who fear the Lord and who take refuge in him can expect good things and abundance of blessings. It's not the perfect who never did anything wrong whom the Lord protects. It is those who fear him and who come to him for refuge and to worship him alone. They are the ones who will receive this good. The Lord shelters them from people's schemes. The Lord's presence becomes a cover for them, and he hides them from people who stir up trouble and seek harm. The psalmist is indeed not visible in these verses, but not because he has been forgotten. He is not visible in the text because he has been sheltered and hidden from enemy schemes. This is like what happened in the wilderness of Ziph, when Saul was only half a mountain away from capturing David. In that moment, God protected David from Saul's scheme by sending the king away before he could do any harm. David thus recognizes that he has not been forgotten, but instead he has been sheltered. This leads to an outburst of praise. Blessed is the Lord, because he has wonderfully shown his faithfulness to me. Where? In a city under siege. See our exegetical issues video for more details on this. This statement, in a city under siege, is difficult to understand unless we remember David's life and the various sieges he underwent. Psalm 11 recalls one such siege, and the siege of Keilah is another example. On both occasions, David was facing the possibility of capture and death, but against all odds, he managed to survive because the Lord delivered him. Verse 23 is a moment of pure honesty. David, in his panic, thought that he had been cut off from the Lord's sight or care. He took his eyes off the Lord and saw cause for despair. But in the midst of utter distress, he cried out for help, and the Lord heard the sound of his pleading. This, in turn, means that the Lord not only became aware of David's plea, but the Lord also responded to it in accordance with their relationship. The principle at work in verse 15 is seen in action again. It is David's responsibility to obey God and cry out to him when in danger. It is God's responsibility to respond to David and rescue him from that danger. The final subsection, verses 24 and 25, opens not with an address to the Lord, but with an address to all his loyal ones. In this address, David directs his attention to those who wait for the Lord, probably meaning people who are in distress of their own, but who trust the Lord to deliver them. Since David has recounted his own experiences of waiting for the Lord earlier in the psalm, he can now encourage this group by saying, "Love the Lord. He's watching over the faithful. He will always be true to his character. He abundantly repays those who act pridefully. He will judge those who are filled with insolence, great disrespect, and arrogance as they seek harm for God's people. There is no danger of the wicked going unpunished." Justice is always double-sided. It includes both rescue for the righteous and judgment for the wicked. The Lord watches over the faithful to rescue them, and he also repays the prideful. The reference to the enemies as prideful at this point repeats wording from verse 19. Prideful is a word used only in poetry in the Hebrew Bible. It often describes those who in their pride rely on their own might, unlike those who are humble and depend on the Lord. Instead of depending on themselves, God's people should wait for the Lord. That is why David encourages his audience by saying, "Be strong, so your hearts may take courage. Whatever distress may befall God's people, they can be strengthened and encouraged as they are waiting for the Lord, because the Lord is faithful to his own." Psalm 31 captures David's journey through fear, faith, and trust in the Lord as his refuge and deliverer. From his plea for protection against enemies who slander and pursue him, to moments of despair where he feels abandoned, David's faith perseveres as he chooses to focus on God's steadfast love and justice. The psalm combines personal lament with public praise, revealing how, even in desperate circumstances, David finds hope and security in the Lord's steadfast presence. The psalm's conclusion broadens David's individual trust by urgently advising and encouraging all believers to remain strong, love God, and wait patiently for his deliverance. In Psalm 31, David's faith withstands affliction and threats against his life, and he finds courage in God's covenant promises and protection. He knows God will always protect him through danger. He can then turn to his community and confidently encourage them to do the same, just as he does, to cling to the Lord as their ultimate refuge. This completes our section-by-section walkthrough of Psalm 31. We'll finish now with a reading of the text that brings everything together.
For the Director, a Psalm by David. I have taken shelter in you, Lord. Do not let my shame continue forever. Rescue me in your righteousness. Listen to me. Rescue me quickly. Be a rock of refuge for me and a fortress to deliver me, because you are my rock and my stronghold. And for the sake of your name, you must carefully guide me. You must save me from the net which they have hidden for me, because you are my refuge. I entrust my spirit into your hand. You have redeemed me, Lord, God of faithfulness. You hate those who worship worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. I will be glad and rejoice on account of your faithfulness, that you saw my affliction. You saved my life from distress, and you did not let any enemy capture me. You set my feet in a broad place. Be gracious to me, Lord, because I am in distress. My eye, my throat, and my belly waste because of anger, because my life fades away with grief, and my years fade away with groaning. My strength has failed because of my iniquity, and my bones waste away. I have been scorned by all of my adversaries, and I have greatly become an object of scorn to my neighbors, and I have become an object of fear to my friends. Those who see me in the street have fled from me. I have been forgotten like a dead person is forgotten from memory. I have become like a broken vessel because I heard the slander of many people. Terror is on every side. When they conspired together against me, they plotted to take my life. But I trust you, Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hand. Deliver me from the hand of my enemies and from my pursuers. Shine your face upon your servant. Save me by your faithfulness. Lord, do not let me be ashamed, because I have called you. May the evil ones be ashamed. May they go silently to Sheol. May lying lips be unable to speak, those that speak insolence against the righteous with arrogance and contempt. How many are your good things, which you have stored for those who fear you, and which you have performed for those who take refuge in you, for all people to see. You shelter them from people's schemes in the cover of your presence. You hide them in a shelter from contentious people. Blessed is the Lord, because he has wonderfully shown his faithfulness to me in a city under siege. Even though I thought in my panic I had been cut off from your sight. However, you heard the sound of my pleading when I cried out to you. Love the Lord, all his loyal ones. The Lord is watching over the faithful, and he abundantly repays those who act pridefully. Be strong, so your hearts may take courage, all who wait for the Lord.